We're going to be talking first about psilocybin, or 4-phosphoryl oh my goodness, 4-phosphoryloxy N-methyltryptamine. So psilocybin is the active ingredient in what is called magic mushrooms. I like that term. Some people don't. There are more than 200 different species of magic mushrooms that exist around the globe in every continent except for Antarctica, as far as I know, growing wild in a range of different mushrooms, not just one genus, for example, multiple different genuses that developed or got the what's called the biosynthetic pathway for producing the molecules that include psilocybin, called psiloids, that produce these effects. Got them through horizontal gene transfer like millions of years ago. This is crazy. So anyways, it's very widespread across the entire globe, across a bunch of different species and different genuses of mushrooms. The one that I understand to be the oldest would be, and the most prolific, would be the Psilocybe genus, and they developed the biosynthetic pathway for the production of psiloids such as psilocybin back like 65 million years ago, like long ass time. Psilocybin is a tryptamine alkaloid. Now, I'm really heavily leaning into my notes here because I'm not an organic chemist, so I'm going to explain this the way I understand it, but you have to keep in mind that I'm not much of a professional or authority on this. But a tryptamine alkaloid, so first off, an alkaloid is a nitrogen-containing compound that is often biologically active, which means it interacts with our nervous system. Common alkaloids that I'm sure many of you have or are presently under the influence of would be something like caffeine or nicotine. Other alkaloids include things like morphine and quinine, which is the compound I believe they use to treat malaria or prevent malaria. Tryptamines are a family of alkaloids. Their molecular structure is built around a particular shape called the indole ring system. You can consider where like different tryptamines as being like slight variations on this ring system, this indole ring system, like jazz variations on a theme. And these variations can range dramatically and create different effects on the mind and nervous system, from complete inactivity to 1,000-fold increases in potency. What I mean by this is you could have a basic indole ring structure, a tryptamine alkaloid, that looks almost identical to another one, but a slight variation creates, like I said, complete inactivity or 1,000-fold increases in potency. Additionally, the tryptamine alkaloid's core structure tends to be very similar to serotonin, which is why classical psychedelics, which are those that would be a splitters group of psychedelics, those that affect the 5-HT2A receptor, are generally considered or often described as serotonin analogs. Psilocybin is a prodrug, which means that it's a prodrug to psilocin, or 4-hydroxy-NN-DMT, 4-HO-DMT. A prodrug means that we take this drug and it turns into another drug. So psilocybin doesn't actually do anything to you in your brain. Oh my God, psilocin does. So you take psilocybin, it converts to psilocin. Psilocin creates these effects that we know as psychedelic, as the psychedelic effects of psilocybin. And well, what are those effects? Like I said, it binds predominantly to the 5-HT2A receptor, which changes firing patterns in neural networks. So our brain is a sort of incredible system of multiple networks of relationships and firing patterns that all sort of work in tandem with each other. And when we alter those firing patterns, when we alter the functioning of those networks, we alter experience, we alter consciousness. Theoretically, you could also say that when we alter our states of awareness, we're altering those firing patterns. At least from the sort of theory that is out on how these things are affecting and changing consciousness, psilocybin is said to affect what's called the default mode network, the DMN. The default mode network is basically what's happening where you are in your brain when you're not doing anything in particular. It is the sort of like random thought generations that just unfold when you're not particularly engaged in like what's called like the task positive network. I'm in the task positive network right now by talking to you. I'm engaging in a task. If I were to just sit here and let my mind wander, I would be entering into the default mode network. The salience network is what jumps us between it, I believe. When we, so basically it's what's happening when we're at rest and we have no explicit cognitive tasks. The default mode network kind of shapes our sense of time, our sense of space, and our sense of self. When we imagine like what it is to feel like to be me, if I ask that question and we go into task positive exploration of that question, we might come up with a lot of answers, or maybe not as many answers as we hope we could. But when we're just at rest, it's like the thoughts, feelings, emotions. It's the things that just run through our mind that kind of like they become the background of experience that becomes the sort of like not always consciously aware aspects of our mind that we define and experience as ourselves. That default mode network, our sense of self, right, also influences the self-other relationship, because our defined sense of space, time, and self influences the parameters, the sort of like dividing lines by which then all things become other. Past self, all things become other. Okay? So when we have this reduction in the default mode network that psilocybin seems to do, that is where we start to get those effects that I talked of earlier. We get the increases in sensory awareness, we get the changes in sort of aesthetic, but we also get the sort of dissolution of those invisible walls that allow certain things to come up, because the default mode network also kind of works to hold things in a particular way. We get things that arise, we get changes in our sense of self, we get even the experience of our sense of self dissolving away. Part of what happens when it's changing the sort of firing pattern, so it alters blood flow in the brain, psilocin does. It changes firing patterns such that the sort of normal direction that things would flow through sensory experience into conscious awareness and understanding of like models and like what we understand things to be and what we perceive them to be and what they, are tangibly in our sensory experience, that sort of normal flow changes, and parts of the brain that normally don't communicate with each other start to communicate with each other. And certain aspects of the brain that normally would be sort of like sub-perceptual or like sort of outside of conscious awareness, because of the change in these blood flow and firing patterns between the communication between these networks, they start to sort of take a stronger or more dominant place in our conscious awareness. So I have this picture up here, which is from the Homological Scaffolds of Brain Functional Networks, a paper from 2014, where you can see on the left is them sort of creating a pretty visual representation of the sort of network intercommunications between networks functioning in the brain. Sober, that would be A, or the left, and then on psilocybin, or psilocybin, in B, and you can see, wow, that's a lot more communication. Now, historically, discussing psilocybin's history is just way too big to do it justice, but what we can say is that psilocybin-containing mushrooms at least were brought to the modern eye thanks to Valentina and R. Gordon Wasson back in 1955. They were introduced to, I believe it was Psilocybe mexicana or Psilocybe mazatepic, or maybe it's cellorescens. It doesn't matter. They were introduced to these psilocybin-containing mushrooms through the indigenous healer Maria Sabina during some mycological research they were doing in southern Mexico. Now, the story there is just so interesting and so complex and at times quite contentious, and I would highly recommend you look into it. It is very interesting. But nonetheless, that is how we became popularly aware of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, because I believe this was a violation of his agreement with Maria Sabina, but Wasson then went out and wrote an article about this, showing her pictures. This is the picture in the middle there, and other information in the Life magazine, which exploded it around the world. Now, historically, what we know about their use in Mexico is that psilocybin-containing mushrooms have been historically used by the indigenous people in Mexico. What we know now, predominantly the Mazatec people, who are at least still using it, or at least were using it in recent memory, but could go back as far as the Aztec people, who called them Teonatacatl, meaning the flesh of the gods, perhaps even as far back as the Olmec people, which are very like the ancient peoples of the land that we now call Mexico. The indigenous use of this mushroom was basically pushed underground due to suppression by way of the Spanish colonizers, which obviously is not good in a lot of ways, but is complex because, it wasn't necessarily without cause. Like the Aztec people were using these mushrooms in ceremonies that included basically human sacrifice while under the influence. And I'm sure there was a lot of use that was not so awful or not so involved with such awful stuff. But the use of mushrooms and human sacrifice and violence was pretty present, at least in the Aztec people. So the part of what pushed the suppression of their use by way of the Spanish colonizers and the sort of like expectations of, I don't know if it was the king or the queen of Spain at the time, and their sort of like Christian ideals, probably not great in some ways, also did have an influence on suppressing human sacrifice, which is probably good. But don't cancel me. I don't know, right? I'm open to different perspectives on that. So on the left, you see a depiction of a statue which was found in a tomb. I don't remember, but in Mexico, and it is the god Chotepili. You have to pardon me. I don't speak, I believe, Nahuatl, which is the name of the language here. And according to Wikipedia, he was the god of beauty, love, passion, sex, sexuality, fertility, art, song, dance, music, painting, writing, games, playfulness, nature, vegetation, and flowers in Aztec mythology. Like, dude was a Renaissance man. It's not the right term, but clearly quite a dynamic representation, dynamic god. He was also considered to be the patron of homosexuality and male prostitutes. But he also considered to maybe have been specifically sort of a representation of working with psychoactive plants, because this statue that you see here has depictions of different psychoactive plants. Specifically, it's got the psilocybin mushroom cap. It's got the morning glory, which contains the chemical very similar to LSD, and the nicotine flower, and I'm not sure those other ones. So that being said, as to the history of psilocybin, we also have what's called the stoned ape theory. Contentious, interesting timeline. I think is pretty good. If psilocybin's been around 65 million years, but effectively, as you can see on the picture from on the right, also from Alex Gray, is the idea that psilocybin mushrooms were involved in the development or the evolution of the human brain such that we became self-aware creatures, that we discovered these mushrooms on the African savanna when it was more of a wet land, I guess, and that upon eating them, we discovered something that ended up having us be more inclined to keep eating them, and we ate them for a period of time, and they had some sort of effect on our brain, which then helped forward our evolution into the self-aware creatures that we are now. Again, contentious, but if we're going to talk about the history of psilocybin, it's important to point out that this is a theory that many people think is reasonably-ish plausible. Now, in terms of its present use and where it's at in clinical and research, we have found that psilocybin can produce classically defined mystical experiences, which is effectively to say that if we give a sufficient enough dose of psilocybin to someone, there's a very high likelihood that they will have an experience that, when described, fits enough of the qualities of what we would call a mystical experience as defined by classical mystical texts to say that that was a mystical experience, which is to say it matches the characteristics of these experiences as it was represented in religious and mystical texts. We know that people generally, from the research, rate their psilocybin experiences as in the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life, next to the death of a parent or the birth of their first child. We know that in clinical practice, there's some evidence for it in a psilocybin therapy session. You could see a picture there from, I think it's John Hopkins, of a psilocybin therapy session, that they're able to seemingly have profoundly positive therapeutic effects for treating things like depression, end of life distress, which is effectively when we're distressed, having anxiety and depression and fear and panic and all the rest for the fact that we're dying, for anorexia, for smoking cessation, for obsessive compulsive disorder. But we have some other interesting things, which is that part of the consequences of consuming psilocybin, other psychedelics are in this camp, but psilocybin in particular for this example, is that it has an effect on effectively the brain's capacity to alter its own, basically to alter its connectivity. Well, we saw the connectivity, that picture of like rapid, more connectivity under the influence, but it also increases what is called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself, as well as provides an uptick in the sort of compounds or the proteins, the neural proteins necessary to make changes in how the brain is kind of laid out. Would be like the functional connectivity, perhaps even the structural connectivity, changing the physical connections. Why that's interesting is because, well, that's likely involved in its therapeutic effects, but it also has shown might be involved with why it is that psilocybin seems to have such a profound effect on things like traumatic brain injury. When we have a traumatic brain injury, our brain is damaged. You might not know it from this talk, but I know well what a traumatic brain injury is like. I've had, unfortunately, a couple of them, and the last one I had has really negatively impacted my life in a very significant way. And I am not the same person. But anyway, so after a traumatic brain injury, your brain doesn't get back the damage. Like it doesn't, pardon that sound, it doesn't repair the damaged neurons. What it does is it remaps. Same with a stroke. When we rehabilitate from a stroke, we don't sort of heal the damaged neurons. They're gone forever for the most part, as far as we know. What we do is we change the structure of the brain such that it can start to adapt and compensate for the lost neurons to regain function. So, for example, if I had a particular pathway that allowed me to speak eloquently and poetically, and that got sheared off and those neurons damaged either through the direct impact or through the secondary injury of ongoing neural inflammation of a traumatic brain injury, that I would never be able to get that back, but I could relearn it such that new pathways could come in to help approximate something akin to it. So this is one of the reasons why we're seeing psilocybin for traumatic brain injury. Also interesting, and I don't have a lot of details on that, but I do have a podcast about it, which I'll link here with Bob Wold, is that psilocybin along with LSD also seems to help interrupt or prevent what's called a cluster headache, or some call suicide headaches, because they're so bad people would rather be dead or literally try to knock themselves unconscious just so they don't have to experience the pain. And seemingly nothing works to make this not happen except psychedelics. It's crazy and incredible. I'll leave a link to that, so if you want to follow up more, but they seem to help with treating cluster headaches. And also, quite interestingly and uniquely psilocybin, is that it seems to increase nature connection. By this, I mean that it increases our sense of being connected with nature, our sense of feeling like we are a part of nature and nature is a part of us, how we experience being in nature, what our perspectives are towards how nature should be treated. It has a significant impact in that seems to be unique amongst all the psychedelics, psilocybin. And as that, some people are starting to suggest that it might be a potential climate change intervention at the individual level. If we go back towards another podcast I did with a man named John Seed, he talks about deep ecology. I've also had someone else on the podcast, Sky Otter, talking about deep ecology. The idea is that instead of trying to change the way we're conducting ourselves with the natural world, with the environment, at the political level, at the top down sort of like legislation into individual level, to sort of bring it from the individual level up by not just changing, by basically changing how we identify and relate with nature, not by changing just our behaviors, but our deep identifications with the natural world. Psilocybin seems to help do that.